Let's start over here. Yes.
Well, I like very much the point about facts don't kill theories, theories kill theories, and the tremendous resilience of the economic core to what seem to be very simple scientific observations that is in some way off. Has to do seemingly with the ability of the core to reinforce itself, both from the macroeconomics and the microeconomics. If we assume, just stipulate that complexity science is something like macroeconomics or network economics done right, then presumably you would also have some kind of solve for X problem where X is microeconomics done right. Why are we opining about the whether or not we should be doing axiomatics for agents when it's likely that the entire stack has this problem of not being scientific? In other words, if you're going to build the stack in physics, you have everything from quantum field theory of the very small to statistical physics and material science of larger systems. Why don't we just look at the entire stack as problematic and try to figure out what fits at the micro level with what you're doing, rather than assuming at the micro level, as has been commented a few times, is sort of not worth looking at axiomatic.
Ricardo, would you like to respond?
Well, I think one way I interpret the different ways in which people are pushing the envelope in this room is that economists have started with the belief that they knew something about human behavior. And that was the only anchor they had to explain the world. And so if you wanted to explain the world, that's your purchase on the world. Now we know with all the behavioral stuff that that anchor of the world was pretty lousy. But for some reason in the 1970s, the notion was that macroeconomics was unbound by going back to fundamentals. And it became a requirement since the 1970s to build micro foundations of macro behavior. And the micro foundations had to go back to individual rationality. But the only way they could solve models was by assuming a ridiculously simplified level of interaction. And what people have been doing here is saying, if you increase a little bit the complexity of those interactions, your intuitions completely disappear. Representative agents disappear, and so on. The line I've been pushing is to say, that's fine, and that's a very valuable point. But we are not just individuals interacting with each other. We are individuals working in organizations, organizations that interact with other organizations, that cooperate or compete with others in a myriad of complicated ways. And the idea that individual rationality has anything to do, or any enlightening thing to say about these very complicated things at the top, suggests that what you're saying, that we should split these things at different levels. That you have quantum mechanics explains one scale, you have other phenomena explain other scales, and it will be many, many moons from now that where we'll be able to integrate all the stuff. That's not the proper agenda for the day. It will be the proper agenda for a century or two from now.
That's right. Does anybody else want to comment on the cross-scale issue?
Well, I just want to clarify. I mean, we're not specifically just interested in macroeconomics. I mean, I think Jean-Philippe and I, for example, work a lot in finance, and it's just, I think the key thing we want to do is focus on having falsifiable theories, empirical facts as the foundation that you use to select the model, and try and make some set of assumptions that allows us to connect one set of phenomena with another set of phenomena in the spirit of phenomenological models in physics, and not get too hung up in the early stages, which I think economics is still in, with trying to found everything with some grand set of principles at the bottom and derive it all up from the top. And let's just make some smaller steps and keep our eyes, use empiricism to keep us focused on the right stuff and not get distracted by irrelevant stuff.
Mauro, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I just want to say that maybe the real problem is emergence. So you have to analyze, you have to have a bottom-up approach, and then try to infer how aggregate stuff and measure from the individual behavior. So measures.
Let's go over here. Eric?
Just building on the debate on scales, asking economics to have a single theory that spans from micro to macro is as ridiculous as asking biologists to have a single theory of the biosphere. Now, what biologists do have, which is scientifically very valid and productive, is they have very strong theories and insights at different levels. Strong work on protein folding, on genetics, on molecular biology, on development biology, and so on. And the key thing is each of those levels is linked to the other. If you have a theory about genetics that violates something about protein folding, your theory is wrong. If you have a theory about genetics that doesn't make sense with what we know about development biology, it's wrong. And by building those tight links, each one constraining the other, you get a very valid body of scientific work, but it's not the same thing as saying there's a single theory. And I think economics can learn from that the program of micro foundations has been just epistemologically mistaken, and instead we should be looking at a multi-level program. And I think what we saw here was actually very good work at different levels, and more work needs to be done to stitch those levels together.
Any final comments on this issue from the panel? Okay, let's go over here. Yeah.
Just to pick up really on the last two questions, I mean, I entirely accept the point about it being useful to look at different, often incommensurable levels of reality. And yet, the micro-foundational counterpart of what's going on at the systems level is important. And what I wanted to, but it doesn't need, of course, to be a simple rational actor representative agent micro-foundational model. It could be a micro-foundation that takes account, for example, of the importance of the human imagination. And my question was, how much difference to the use of complexity theory does consideration of the influence of the imagination and of novel ideas that introduce new parameters make to the way you model and simulate? And does consideration of mutations in narratives and images of what's going on change the way you use complexity theory? And in particular, does it mean that you use simulations to spot emerging dynamics rather than make conditional predictions? And does it mean that you're much more careful than perhaps I sensed in Doine's presentation in being careful about data mining? Because after all, data is partly a product of the models and the hypotheses and classification systems you use to collect the data.
We could add emotions to that list too, in addition to imagination. Who would like to start with that?
Well, there's about 3 or 4 really questions that could take long responses there. I mean, the imagination, I think we all agree that creativity and innovation are critical things. I think you may be disappointed that the models we end up with for innovation are pretty simple, because as scientists, that's all we really know how to do. So it's often just some random mutation, but it might involve, say, using building blocks rather than just doing things completely at random, so combining building blocks, or it might involve really trying to understand the constraints that institutions and other factors put on the imagination to try and understand how things are directed. And I think in part, I think I could interpret Ricardo's theory that way. You also mentioned data mining. I'm very alert to that and actually forgot to say something in my talk. I worry that the model we have of Washington, D.C. has been data mined and is overfit. I mean, data mining is fine. It's overfitting that's the bad thing. And that's one of the reasons, though, we made a regional model, is because there's 40 or 50 regions in the United States that we can sensibly model. When we go to region 2, I expect our model is going to belly flop. We'll have to adjust parameters again. My hope is that by the time we get to region 5 or 10, we'll start to see that the model starts to just work out of the can. And then we'll begin to understand that we're really generalizing correctly out of sample. And you had, there was that and there was a third? Okay.
Mauro, it strikes me that this question is relevant to your research program, because in your version of agent-based modeling, you have agents with rich understandings of the world, and those can in a sense be interpreted as narratives. or something. Are you thinking in those terms at all?
No, I think that it's quite important that you can falsify a theory of the order model at different level of aggregation. So you don't need to have one theory good for everything. This is good for mainstream economics and the International Monetary Fund, which is trying to sell to save banks rather than people. But according to the complexity stuff, you should have a lot of different theories, depending also on the context you are in. So it depends on the structure network, on the situation, and I think.
Let me say one thing just in response, because it's relevant to the work we're doing at the University of Waterloo. I think the pot of gold at the end of the agent-based model rainbow would be to have agents with what you could call rich intentionality. Intentionality in the John Searlean sense, the philosopher of language, where this is networks of meaning, rich connected sets of concepts that can co-evolve between agents over time, so they learn from each other, as Mauro was suggesting, and new things happen that you wouldn't be expecting in terms of their understanding of the world. So intentionality in the sense of aboutness, which is the way Searle was referring to it. Now that actually takes us into a whole new realm, potentially, of modeling. And in that case, you can probably start to include something that would be involve approximations of imagination and narrative, and certainly emotion. Why don't we see over here? Yes.
I'd just like to pick up on the point that was made here about different levels. And the argument, if I understand it correctly, was that if I go to level 2 and then I find that I'm seeing something which is in contradiction with what I assumed at level 1, then I should realize that that's a contradiction and do something about it. But in economics, I think it's a little more complex than that, because, for example, think of the weak axiom of real preference, which everybody learns about in their first year microeconomics. And what we know is that if you go to level 2, if you have 2 people, if you aggregate them up, they may not satisfy that, but that's what's necessary for demand. But that doesn't mean that the guys underneath are violating this. They could be satisfying it, and yet when I'm at the next level, the aggregate won't satisfy it. So it's not, I don't see it quite as I look at each level to verify whether the level below was correct or not. It's the fact that you aggregate that changes the nature of that assumption. The aggregate won't have that property, but that doesn't mean that the individuals don't.
Do you want to respond? Because I think there may actually be a bit of a disconnect here, and it just needs to be addressed.
Well, I think you also need to verify the facts within a level, and whether people actually do behave according to weak preference theory. And we had some interesting discussion on as-if theories and heuristics and behavior and the type of work people like Cars does. And the question is they may not. So we first have to get solid empirical theories within a level on the aggregation we're interested in, and then also test that against connections and look for flaws and inconsistencies across levels. So you need to do both.
And my interpretation is it may occasionally be the case that the new theory shows that there's something wrong in one of the adjacent theories that has previously been accepted.
And key point, it causes you to ask the right questions.
Right. Good. Let's go to the back here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Anna Maria. I'm a graduate student in computational social science. And my question is, how do you see the future of the field of complexity economics or computational economics? Is it a complex adaptive science in the evolution of science? That's a more general question, and a more specific question for Professor Hausman. Essentially, the Scrabble theory is a combinatorial approach of the how products and technology play out in the world. There are also some combinatorial theories about human skills. And do you think if you introduce the human skills and the combinatorial approach of human skills and education, that you can raise up the R squared to be higher than 0.7? Because I think still human skills and education are important for globalization, and I was wondering where Switzerland, for instance, was on that map. Thank you.
Jean-Philippe, would you like to take the first question, the general question?
I'm not very good at these general statements about where the field is going.
Just want to
I
give
think,
you an opportunity.
I'm modestly trying to understand, but maybe I can say something about the previous discussion that I failed to do, and I probably would like to do, is for the moment, I think that one of the problems of these agent-based models, and I think that this understanding of how you go from micro to macro is very important, because in my experience, even the simplest model of just financial markets, say, not even the whole economy, is 12 parameters, and there's absolutely no way to pin these parameters in any reasonable manner, I think. So I think it's important first to kind of have an exploratory phase. So that's why I'm not sure I know where the field is going, because I think at first there's a lot of thought to be made about what are we expecting to get in the end. And so classify these systems with a lot of parameters into possible behaviors is I think, a very important first step. Otherwise, we won't be able to pin down what we want to pin down. And so in the example I know of our own agents-based model of a financial market, out of these 12 parameters that we couldn't reduce, actually 2 of them were only important to give qualitatively different types of markets. All the other ones were quantitatively important if you wanted to, I don't know, reproduce the volatility or so on, but they were not fundamental in the understanding. So that's really what I believe is needed, is understanding, categorizing the possible behaviors from micro ingredients. And so, for example, things that you're talking about, like imagination or narratives, I think maybe these are emergent properties that feed back on the system itself. And so that's a very important problem as well, I think.
Yeah. I have the impression that in a complex system like social science research, there's no central planner that has the overall view. So the system will somehow self-organize. I see that there are some markets where the idea that agents are fairly simple is sort of like, okay, housing, finance, their individuals are buying, selling, and stuff, and you can imagine those having great insights from agent-based modeling. But if you ask yourself, what makes a city being able to make a car or make a photographic machine, okay? What does it take? Who needs to know what? If you ask yourself the opposite question, where is knowledge stored? Where is knowledge stored? I mean, this 25 times higher productivity in the US today than 200 years ago is essentially because we know much more stuff. Who is it that knows much more stuff? Because we as individuals are not more intelligent than we were 200 years ago. So what's been happening is that this knowledge is being stored in many different brains out there, and then it's being reaggregated. Well, we need to have a language to explore that. So I like this idea that we need the narratives. Knowledge is being stored in many different places. If we think of ourselves as just homogeneous agents or agents with different strategies, we are disregarding the fact that we're playing very potentially complementary roles in society, and we want to know what are those roles, how those roles change as knowledge changes, as forms of interaction and organization change. And I think it's over that tissue. That's why I'm so insistent that we should not collapse these things, going back to the agent, because we are destroying a lot of the texture that is relevant at higher levels of aggregation.
Yes, here.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for great talks. I think we have a tendency to think of economics as an ideology that hasn't changed in 50 years. and if you violate one of the assumptions in a paper, you'll never get it published. I want to remind people that since then we've had game theory, evolutionary game theory, behavioral game theory. We've had Kahneman and Tversky get published in Econometrica. People who do behavioral economics, and I'm one of them, are well accepted. A third of the articles in the journals violate self-interest, etc. So economics, to me, has been incredibly open to change. And this is important because, you know, if you're a young guy or girl and you're working in this area, you want to get a job and you want to think that you can be part of the profession. You don't have to, you know, be outside. I just want to say we should not gather our wagons in a circle and talk to each other, because if you've got a good idea, complexity, and I think they are good ideas, you know, in 10 years it will be part of the with received curriculum and the received wisdom in economics.
And it might start within INET, it might start within INET, and that's part of the project here. Don, did you want to say something?
I mean, I think your perspective as an economist is different from mine as an outsider. I'm an outsider, and I've worked in machine learning, I've worked in biology, I was trained as a physicist, I've worked in mathematics. Economics is by far the most closed profession of those, and the most resistant to change, and the most resistant to challenging theories with facts. And despite what you said, I agree that change happens. I mean, if change doesn't happen, it's ridiculous. But economics has been very unwilling to open its intellectual discourse to ideas that make it nervous and make economists nervous.
Quick response, then we're going to take, oh boy, we're going to take 3 more after that.
15 years ago,
and
we who were working in behavioral economics, which was not accepted at all by the profession, we said we're not going to do an end run around economics. We're going to get published in standard journals, and if we can't, then it's our fault. It's not their fault. And it's worked out quite nicely. I know physics is very open, and economics is not like that, but try biology or social psychology or some other field. They're much more closed.
No.
I mean, we get
published in biology, Herb.
Yeah,
it's much better than
on my
economics.
end, where we bring in new ideas and we publish in biological journals, we get these really heavy critiques, and I mean ad hominem, vitriolic, you know.
why don't we take this conversation offline?
We should do this offline.
Let's move on. I think I'm going to take 3 more. There, here, and I'm sorry, I have to make a choice. So we'll take the fellow at the back.
Thank you. My name is Maya Göpel. I'm a political economist, and I would like to pick up that debate that was there and take it one level further into the sense-making individuals that we're working with. And for many of the people working in politics or in firms or just being an investor or something, you do look for sense-making narratives for what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think that bringing in power and bringing in structural power is important to understand why certain disciplines and certain ways of thinking are more resilient to change, and path dependencies in our institutions in self-selecting circles of who's coming in out of a purely maybe needing confirmation of my own train of thought. I'm picking the people that are closer to it. So I think psychology can tell us a lot, and sociology, why certain paradigms are more resistant to others. And connecting it with material elements and with power, I think is important to really get that picture going.
Any comments on power? I should talk to that being a political scientist, but it's largely left out of this conversation. It's strikingly important. Yes?
Okay, just a quick remark and a question. I mean, to Herbert Gintis, I mean, economics is really not open. I think I can show you dozens of examples of rejected papers by the argument that expectations are not model consistent. So it's just not very open, I would say. A question, you know, complex systems. If I compare Doyne's talk to Jean-Philippe's talk, Doyne has a very detailed agent-based model, and Jean-Philippe has a more simpler complexity model. So the issue of how complex should complexity models be, I'd like you to comment on that. I mean, to challenge Doyne a little bit, you know, the patterns you showed in the fitting of the agent-based model, I mean, couldn't one also do that with a simpler behavioral model, get the same kind of fit? So what's your view? How detailed should these models be?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in favor of models being at many different levels of detail. And if you look at most of my papers, they're not agent-based models, and they're very simplified, ideas about what the agents are doing. And but I think you need different things for different purposes. And in fact, I think if I wanted to make one pitch for economics, it's put more tools in the toolkit. To me, economists are like people that have learned how to use hammers, and they have toolkits that have nothing but hammers in them. Let's put some screwdrivers and some saws and other things in the toolkit. And I guess I think that you need to do what you need to do to explain what you want to explain. Second point would be there's different ways to approach it. Sometimes it's good to just say, let's take all the pieces of this system that we think we can model realistically, try and calibrate them all independently of each other, and then let's put them together and see if what we get back works. So that's, say, what climate scientists do. Those models are not simple, but they've been very informative to the field. We know, they put the models together, they said, look, we're not capturing ocean circulation right, and we need to look at the ocean-air interface better. Then they said, well, we're not getting cloud formation right. As a result, huge funding for satellites to better measure clouds, artificial intelligence methods to process the images, fundamental science on clouds, finer grain grids to, allow the simulation. So the point is, that's a different kind of science than other kinds, and I both need to exist together to get things right in the end. And I don't think we should be too prejudiced about which method we take.
Yeah, just wanting to reiterate what I said, that I think it's complementary actually, but if you don't have these simple cartoon models that try to extract the phenomena, then I think that it's very easy to get lost in the number of parameters. But then if you understand better what mechanism you should expect from an underlying model, then you can be more greedy and try more parameters. It's a back and forth thing.
The way I see it is that complexity theorists they recognize the world is actually complex, and it may require complex theories to explain those complex phenomena. You try to start simple, but you're less hung up on parsimony and Occam's razor. There's a willingness to give up parsimony if it seems, greater willingness to give up parsimony if it seems necessary to get the explanatory power you need. Let's go over here.
Cameron Hepburn at the London School of Economics. Thank you for 4 very interesting talks, and thanks in general for pursuing complexity science as it's applied to economics, because I think it has a lot to add. And thanks in particular for the Scrabble theory of production, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and look forward to seeing that applied in the services area as well, perhaps with a bit more difficulty. I just have a short comment about the question of levels, which might be helpful. If you think of science and economics as analogous to map construction, you're seeking to depict various bits of reality in a way that's helpful. It's not necessarily accurate. Maps aren't accurate. A one-to-one map of the world is not useful. Then as you move through these different scales, different bits of your map disappear. If you zoom out of Google Maps, roads vanish. Now the fact that a road isn't on a zoomed out image compared with the fact that it might be on a zoomed in image doesn't mean that the zoomed out image is wrong. It's just omitted a feature of reality because it's convenient and appropriate for it to do that. So I think Eric's point about kind of finding the thread between the different levels that is constraining is a good one, but it's also important to recognize that we need to work out when a road is simply absent or when a road is in the wrong place. Because when a road's in the wrong place, that tells you something. When a road's absent, it's okay, you're just at a different scale. And I think that kind of answers the query about the weak axiom of revealed preference. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Any final comments on any of these issues from the panelists?
I was thinking about this debate Herb and I had, which I want to sort of recast it in a more, let's say, reflective way.
But no response. Okay, talk later.
Well, I mean, I think the challenge we have is that we want to change a lot of things. Usually, and there's a good reason for just changing things one at a time. Generally, the right approach is to make change fairly evolutionary in the sense that you take something and you modify a feature or two. The problem is if you want to modify a bunch of features at once, sometimes you do genuinely need to make a step where you change a lot of things because the things that you want to have to be compatible with each other, and you can't just change things one at a time because then they're incompatible with the rest of the stuff. And I think that's the challenge we're facing. We want to change the kinds of questions that economists should ask. We want to change the kind of answers that should be accepted. We want to change the methods for getting there. And we really want to change the whole thing. And that's very difficult to do. And that's why, I mean, I would love it if we could have an evolutionary path to get where we want to go. But I don't see that evolutionary path. And the referees that I have from the papers I submit to economics journals certainly don't see that path. So,
well, with that statement of the revolutionary intent of complexity economics, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the panelists. I think it was marvelous. And I do ask you all to try to put your vote in with the INET folks to make sure that there is a significant complexity theory presence at the next conference. Thank you very much.